I Am Not a Serial Killer by Dan Wells. Mrs. Anderson was dead. Nothing flashy, just old age. She went to bed one night and never woke up. They say it was peaceful, dignified way to die, which I suppose is technically true, but the 3 days it took for someone to realize they hadn't seen her in a while removed most of the dignity from the situation. Her daughter eventually dropped by to check on her and found her corpse 3 days rotted and stinking like roadkill. The worst part isn't the rotting, it's the 3 days. 3 whole days before anyone cared enough to say, "Wait, where's that old lady that lives down by the canal?" There's not a lot of dignity in that. But peaceful? Certainly. She died quietly in her sleep on August 30th, according to the coroner, which means she died 2 days before something tore Jeb Jolly's insides out and left him in a puddle behind the laundromat. We didn't know it at the time, but that made Mrs. Anderson the last person in Clayton County to die of natural causes for almost 6 months. The Clayton killer got the rest. Well, most of them. All but one. We got Mrs. Anderson's body on Saturday, September 2nd, after the coroner was done with it, or I guess I should say that my mom and Aunt Margaret got the body, not me. They're the ones who run the mortuary. I'm only 15. I've been in town most of the day, watching the police clean up the mess with Jeb, and came back just as the sun was beginning to go down. I slipped in the back just in case my mom was up front. I didn't really want to see her. No one was in the back yet, just me and Mrs. Anderson's corpse. It was lying perfectly still on the table under a blue sheet. It smelled like rotten meat and bug spray, and the lone ventilator fan buzzing loudly overhead wasn't doing much to help. I washed my hands quietly in the sink, wondering how long I had, and gently touched the body. Old skin was my favorite, dry and wrinkled, with a texture like antique paper. The coroner hadn't done much to clean up the body, probably because they were busy with Jeb, but the smell told me that at least they thought to kill the bugs. After 3 days and end of summer heat, there'd probably been a lot of them. A woman swung open the door from the front end of the mortuary and came in, looking like a surgeon in her green scrubs and mask. I froze, thinking it was my mom, but the woman just glanced at me and walked to the counter. "Hi, John," she said, collecting some sterile rags. It wasn't my mom at all. It was her sister, Margaret. They were twins, and when their faces were masked, I could barely tell the difference. Margaret's voice was a little higher, a little more energetic. I figured it was because she'd never been married. "Hi, Margaret." I took a step back. "Ron's getting lazier," she said, picking up a squirt bottle of dish spray. "He didn't even clean her, just declared natural causes and shipped her over. Mrs. Anderson deserves better than this." She turned to look at me. "You just gonna stand there, or are you gonna help me?" "Sorry." "Wash up." I rolled up my sleeves eagerly and went back to the sink. "Honestly," she went on, "I don't even know what they do over there at the coroner's office. It's not like they're busy. We can barely stay in business here." "Jeb Jolly died," I said, drying my hands. "They found him this morning behind the wash and dry." "The mechanic?" asked Margaret, her voice dropping lower. "That's terrible. He's younger than I am. What happened?" "Murdered," I said. I pulled a mask and apron from the hook on the wall. "They thought maybe it was a wild dog, but his guts were kind of in a pile." "That's terrible," Margaret said. Well, you're the one worried about going out of business, I said. 2 bodies in 1 weekend is money in the bank. Don't even joke like that, John, she said, looking at me sternly. Death is a sad thing, even when it pays your mortgage. You ready? Yeah. Hold her arm out. I grabbed the body's right arm, pulled it straight. Rigor mortis makes a body so stiff you can barely move it, but it only lasts about a day and a half. And this one has been dead so long the muscles had all relaxed again. Though the skin was papery, the flesh underneath was soft, like dough. Margaret sprayed the arm with disinfectant, began wiping it gently with a cloth. Even when the coroner does his job and cleans the body, we always watch it ourselves before we start. Embalming is a long process with a lot of precise work, and you need a clean slate to start with. It stinks pretty bad, I said. She stinks pretty bad, I said. Mom and Margaret were adamant that we be respectful to the deceased, but it seemed a little late at this stage. It wasn't a person anymore, it was just a body. A thing. She does smell, said Margaret. Poor woman. I wish someone had found her sooner. She looked up at the ventilator fan buzzing behind its grate in the ceiling. Let's hope that motor doesn't burn out on us tonight. Margaret said the same thing before every embalming, like a sacred chant. The fan continued creaking overhead. Leg, she said. I moved down to the body's foot, pulled the leg straight while Margaret sprayed it. Turn your head. I kept my gloved hands on the foot and turned to stare at the wall when Margaret lifted up the sheet to wash the upper thighs. Well, one good thing that came of this, though, she said, is that you can bet every widow in the county got a visit today, or is going to get one tomorrow. Everyone who hears about Mrs. Anderson is going to go straight to their own mother just to make sure. Other leg. I wanted to say something about how everyone who heard about Jeb would go straight to their auto mechanic, but Margaret never appreciated jokes like that. We moved around the body, leg to arm, arm to torso, torso to head, until the whole thing was scrubbed and disinfected. The room smelled like death and soap. Margaret tossed the rags in the laundry bin and started gathering the real embalming supplies. I've been helping Mom and Margaret at the mortuary since I was a little boy, back before Dad left. My first job had been cleaning up the chapel, picking up programs, dumping out ashtrays, vacuuming the floor, and other odd jobs that a 6-year-old could do unassisted. I got bigger jobs as I grew older, but I didn't get to help with the really cool stuff, embalming, until I was 12. Embalming was like, I don't know how to describe it. It's like playing with a giant doll, dressing it and bathing it and opening it up to see what's inside. I watched Mom once when I was 8, peeking in through the door to see what the big secret was. When I cut open my teddy bear the next week, I don't think she made the connection. Margaret handed me a wad of cotton. I held it at the ready while she packed small tufts carefully under the body's eyelids. The eyes were beginning to recede, deflating as they lost moisture, and cotton helped keep the right shape for the viewing. It helped keep the eyelids closed as well, but Margaret always added a bit of sealing cream just in case, to keep the moisture in and the lid closed. Get me the needle gun, will you, John? She asked, and I hurried to put down the cotton and grab the gun from a metal table by the wall. The gun is a long metal tube with 2 finger holes on the side, like a hypodermic needle. Can I do it this time? Sure, she said, pulling back the body's cheek and upper lip. Right here. I placed the gun gently up against the gums and squeezed, embedding a small needle into the bone. The teeth were long and yellow. We added one more needle to the lower jaw and threaded a wire through both of them, and then twisted it tight to keep the mouth closed. Margaret smeared sealing cream on the small plastic support like the peel of an orange wedge, placed it inside the mouth to hold everything closed. Once the face was taken care of, we arranged the body carefully, straightening the legs and folding the arms across the chest in the classic "I'm dead" pose. Once the formaldehyde gets into the muscles, they seize up and go rigid. You have to set the features first thing, so the family doesn't have a misshapen corpse at the viewing. "Hold her head," said Margaret, and I obediently put a hand on each side of the corpse's head to keep it steady. Margaret probed with her fingers a bit just above the right collarbone, and then she sliced a long, shallow line in the hollow of the old woman's neck. It's almost bloodless when you cut a corpse, because the heart's not pumping. There's no blood pressure, and gravity pulls all the blood down into the body's back. Because this one had been dead longer than usual, the chest was limp and empty while the back was nearly purple, like a giant bruise. Margaret reached into the hole with a small metal hook and pulled out 2 big veins. Well, technically an artery and a vein, and looped a string around each one. They were purple and slick, 2 dark loops that pulled out of the body a few inches and then slipped back in. Margaret turned to prepare the pump. Most people don't realize how different chemical embalmers use. But the first thing that catches your eye is not how many there are, but how many different colors they are. Each bottle, the formaldehyde, the anticoagulants, the cauterants, the germicides, the conditioners, and others, has its own bright color like fruit juice. The row of embalming fluids looks like syrup flavors at a snow cone stand. Margaret chose her chemicals carefully, like she's choosing ingredients for a soup. Not every body needed every chemical, and figuring out the right recipe for a given corpse was as much an art as science. While she worked on that, I let go of the head and picked up the scalpel. They didn't always let me make incisions, but if I did it while they weren't watching, I could usually get away with it. And I was good at it too, which helped. The artery Margaret had pulled out would be used to pump the body full of the chemical cocktail she was making. As they filled the body, the old fluids like blood and water would be pushed out to the exposed vein and into the drain tube, and from there, into the floor. I've been surprised to find out that it all just goes into the sewer system, but really, where else would it go? It's no worse than anything else down there. I held the artery steady, cut slowly across it, careful not to sever it completely. And when the hole was ready, I grabbed the cannula, a curved metal tube, and slipped the narrow end into the opening. The artery was rubbery like a thin hose, and covered with tiny fibers of muscle and capillary. I laid the metal tube gently on the chest and made similar cut in the vein, this time inserting a drain pipe, which connected to a long coil of clear plastic tubing that snaked down into the drain of the floor. I clinched tight the strings Margaret had looped around each vein, sealing them shut. "That looks good," said Margaret, pushing the pump over to the table. It was on wheels to keep it out of the way, but now it took its place of honor in the center of the room, while Margaret connected the main hose to the cannula I'd placed in the artery. She studied the seal briefly, nodding at me in approval. Pour the first chemical, this bright orange anticoagulant, to break up the clots, into the tank on top. She pushed the button, and the pump jerked sleepily to life. Syncopated like a real heartbeat, and she watched it carefully while she fiddled with the knobs that controlled pressure and speed. The pressure in the body normalized quickly, and soon dark, thick blood was disappearing into the sewer. "How's school?" Margaret asked, peeling off a rubber glove to scratch her head. "It's only been a couple days," I said. "Not a lot happens in the first week." "Well, it's the first week of high school, though," said Margaret. "That's pretty exciting, isn't it?" Not especially, I said. The anticoagulant was almost gone, so Margaret poured a bright blue conditioner into the pump to help get the blood vessels ready for the formaldehyde. She sat down. Meet any new friends? Yeah, I said. A whole new school moved into town over the summer, so miraculously I'm not stuck with the same people I've known since kindergarten. And of course, they all wanted to make friends with the weird kid. It was pretty sweet. You shouldn't make fun of yourself like that, she said. Actually, I was making fun of you. You shouldn't do that either, said Margaret. And I could tell by her eyes that she was grinning slightly. She stood back up to add more chemicals to the pump. Now that the first two chemicals were on their way through the body, she began mixing the true embalming fluid, a moisturizer and a water softener to keep the tissues from swelling, preservatives and germicides to keep the body in good condition, well, as good a condition as it could be at this point, and dye to give it a rosy, lifelike glow. The key to it all, of course, is formaldehyde, a strong poison that kills everything in the body and hardens the muscles, pickles the organs, and does all the actual embalming. Margaret added a hefty dose of formaldehyde, followed by thick green perfume to cover the pungent aroma. The pump tank was a swirling pot of brightly colored goop, like the slush machine at a gas station. Margaret clamped down the lid and ushered me out the back door. The fan wasn't good enough to risk being in the room with that much formaldehyde. It was fully dark outside now, and the town had gone silent. I sat on the back step while Margaret leaned against the wall, watching through the open door in case anything went wrong. Do you have any homework yet? She asked. I have to read the introductions of most of my textbooks over the weekend, which of course everybody always does. And I have to write an essay for my history class. Margaret looked at me, trying to be nonchalant. But her lips were pressed tightly together, and she stared, blinking. I knew from long association that this meant something was bothering her. Did they assign a topic? She asked. I kept my face impassive. Major figures of American history. So, George Washington or Lincoln? I already wrote it. That's great, she said, not really meaning it. She paused a moment longer, then dropped her pretense. Do I have to guess, or are you going to tell me which of your psychopaths you wrote it on? They're not my psychopaths. John. Dennis Rader, I said, looking out at the street. They just caught him a few years ago, so I thought it had a nice current events angle. John, Dennis Rader is the BTK killer. He's a murderer. They asked for a great figure, not a... The teacher asked for a major figure, not a great one, so bad guys count, I said. He even suggested John Wilkes Booth as one of those options. There's a big difference between political assassin and a serial killer. I know, I said, looking back at her. That's why I wrote it. You're a really smart kid, said Margaret, and I mean that. You're probably the only student that already finished with the essay, but you can't. It's not normal, John. I was really hoping you'd grow out of this obsession with murderers. Not murderers, I said. Serial killers. That's the difference between you and the rest of the world, John. We don't see a difference. She went back inside to start work on the body cavity, sucking out all the bile and poison until the body was purified and clean. Staying outside in the dark, I stared up at the sky and waited. I don't know what I was waiting for. We didn't get Jeb Jolly's body that night, or even soon after. I spent the next week in breathless anticipation, running home from school every afternoon to see if it had arrived yet. Felt like Christmas. The coroner was keeping the body much longer than usual in order to perform a full autopsy. The Clayton Daily had articles on the death every day, finally confirming on Tuesday that the police suspected murder. Their first impression had been that Jeb was killed by a wild animal, but there were apparently several clues that pointed to something more deliberate. The nature of those clues was not, of course, revealed. It was the most sensational thing happening in Clayton County my whole life. On Thursday, we got our history essays back. I got full points and interesting choice written in the margin. The kid I hung out with, Maxwell, missed 2 points for length and 2 more for spelling. He'd written half a page about Albert Einstein, then spelled Einstein a different way every time. It's not like there's a whole lot to say about Einstein, said Max, as we sat at a corner table at the school cafeteria. He discovered E equals mc squared and nuclear bombs, and that's it. I'm lucky I got half a page at all. I didn't really like Max, which was one of the most socially normal things about me. Nobody really liked Max. He was short and kind of fat with glasses and an inhaler and a closet full of secondhand clothes. More than that, he had a brash, grating attitude. He would speak too loudly and too authoritatively on subjects that he really knew very little about. In other words, he acted like the bullies, but without any of the strength or charisma to back it up. This all suited me fine because he had one quality I desired in a school acquaintance. He liked to talk and didn't care much if I paid attention to him or not. As part of my plan to remain inconspicuous. Alone, we were just one weird kid who talked to himself and one weird kid who never talked to anyone. Together, we were 2 weird kids having a semblance of a conversation. It wasn't much, but it made us look a little more normal. 2 wrongs made a right. Clayton High School was old and falling apart, like everything else in town. Kids bussed here from all over the county, and I guess a good third of the students came from farms and townships outside the city limits. There was a couple of kids I didn't know. Some of the outlying families homeschooled their kids up until high school, but for the most part, the kids here were the same old crowd I'd grown up with since kindergarten. Nobody new ever came to Clayton. They just drove through the interstate and barely glanced as they passed by. The city lay on the side of the highway and decayed like a dead animal. "Who did you write about?" said Max. What?" I hadn't been paying attention. "I asked who you wrote about for your essay," said Max. "I'm guessing John Wayne." "Why would I do John Wayne?" "Because you're named after him." He was right. My name is John Wayne Cleaver. My sister's name is Lauren Bacall Cleaver. My dad was a big fan of old movies. Being named after someone doesn't mean they're interesting, I said, still watching the crowd. "Why didn't you write about Maxwell House?" "Is that a guy?" asked Max. "I thought it was a coffee company." "I wrote about Dennis Rader," I told him. "He was BTK." "What's BTK?" "Bind, torture, kill," I said. BTK was how Dennis Rader signed his name in all the letters he wrote to the media. "That's sick, man," said Max. "How many people did he kill?" He obviously wasn't too disturbed by it. "Maybe 10, I said. "The police aren't sure yet." "Only 10? said Max. "That's nothing. You could kill more than that robbing a bank. That guy in your project last year was way better at it than that." "It doesn't matter how many they kill," I told him. "And it's not awesome. It's wrong." "Then why do you talk about them all the time?" asked Max. "Because wrong is interesting." I was only partially engaged in the conversation. Mostly I was thinking about how cool it would be to see a body that was all taken apart after an autopsy. "You're weird, man," said Max, taking another bite of his sandwich. "That's all there is to say." Someday you're going to kill a whole bunch of people, probably more than 10, because you're such an overachiever. And then they're going to have me on TV and ask if I saw this coming. I'm going to say, hell yes, like I was seriously screwed up. Then I guess I have to kill you first, I said. Nice try, said Max, laughing, pulling out his inhaler. I'm like your only friend in the world. You wouldn't kill me. He took a puff from his inhaler and tucked it back into his pocket. Besides, my dad was in the army. And you're a skinny emo. I like to see you try. Jeffrey Dahmer, I said, only half listening to Max. What? The project I did last year was Jeffrey Dahmer. I said he was a cannibal who kept severed heads in his freezer. I remember now, said Max, his eyes darkening. Your posters gave me nightmares. That was boss. Nightmares are nothing, I said. Those posters gave me a therapist. I'd been fascinated. I'd tried not to use the word obsessed with serial killers for a long time. But it wasn't until my Jeffrey Dahmer report in the last week of middle school that Mom and my teachers got worried enough to put me into therapy. My therapist's name was Dr. Ben Neblin, and over the summer I'd had an appointment with him every Wednesday morning. We talked about a lot of things, like my father being gone, what a dead body looked like, how pretty fire was, but mostly we talked about serial killers. He told me that he didn't like the subject and that it made him uncomfortable, but that didn't stop me. My mom paid for the sessions and I didn't really have anyone else to talk to, so Neblin got to hear it all. After school started for the fall, our appointments were moved to Thursday afternoons, so when my class ended, I loaded up my backpack with its way too many books and pedaled the 6 blocks over to Neblin's office. Halfway there, I was turned at the corner by the old theater and took a detour. The wash and dry was only 2 blocks down. I wanted to ride by the place where Jeb got killed. The police tape was down now, finally, and the laundromat was open but empty. The black wall only had one window and a small barred yellow one that I assumed belonged to the restroom. The back lot was almost completely isolated, which the newspaper said was making the police investigation pretty hard. No one had seen or heard the attack, even though they guessed it had happened around 10 o'clock at night. Most of the bars were still open. Jeb had probably been coming home from one when he died. I half expected to find some big chalk outlines on the asphalt, one for the body, with another for the infamous pile of innards nearby. Instead, the whole area had been scoured with high-pressure hose, and all the blood, gravel were washed away. I dropped my bike by the wall, walked around slowly to see what, if anything, I could see. The asphalt was shaded and cool. Part of the wall had been scrubbed as well, almost to the roof. But it wasn't hard to figure out where the body had been. I knelt down and peered closely at the ground, spotting here and there purple smudge on the texture of the asphalt, where dried blood had clung and resisted water. After a minute, I found a darker stain on the ground nearby, a hand-sized splotch of something blacker and thicker than blood. I picked at it with my fingernails and a bit came off like greasy ash, as if someone had cleaned out a charcoal barbecue. I wiped my fingers off on my pants and stood up. It was strange, standing in a place where someone had died. Cars buzzed slowly by on the street, muted by walls and distance. I tried to imagine what happened here, where Jeb had been coming from, where he was going, why he cut through the back lot, where he had been standing when the killer attacked. Perhaps he had been late for something, rushed through to save time. Or maybe he was drunk and weaving dangerously, uncertain where he was. In my mind, I saw him red-faced and grinning, oblivious to the death that stalked him. I pictured the attacker, too, thinking only for a moment where I would hide if I were to kill someone here. There were shadows all over the lot, odd angles of fence and wall and ground. Perhaps the killer had lain in wait behind an old car, or crouched behind a telephone pole. I imagined him lurking in the dark, calculating eyes peering out as Jeb stumbled past, boozy and defenseless. Was he angry? Was he hungry? The shifting theories of police were ominous and tantalizing. What could attack so brutally yet so carefully? But the evidence pointed to both man and a beast. I imagined swift claws and bright teeth slashing through moonlight and flesh, sending arcs of blood high into the wall behind. I lingered a moment longer, guiltily taking it all in. Dr. Neblin would wonder why I was late, and would chastise me when I told him where I'd gone, but that's not what bothered me. In coming here, I was digging at the foundations of something larger and deeper, scratching tiny lines in a wall I dare not breach. There was a monster behind that wall, and I'd built it strong to keep the monster at bay. Now it stirred and stretched, restless in its dreaming. There's a new monster in town, it seemed. Would its presence awaken the one I kept hidden? It was time to go. I broke one of my rules today, I said, looking down through the blinds over Dr. Neblin's office window to the street below. Bright cars rolled past in an uneven parade. I could feel Neblin's eyes in the back of my head, studying. One of your rules? He asked. His voice was even and steady. He was one of the calmest people I knew. But then again, I spent most of my time with Mom, Margaret, and Lauren. His calmness was one of the reasons I came here so willingly. I have rules, I said, to keep myself from doing anything wrong. What kind of things? What kind of wrong things? I asked, or what kind of rules? I'd like to hear about both, but you can start with whatever you want. Then we better start with the things I'm trying to avoid, I said. The rules won't make sense to you if you don't know those. That's fine, he said. I turned back to face him. He was a short man, mostly bald on top, wearing small round glasses with thin black frames. He always carried a pad of paper and occasionally made notes while we talked. They used to make me nervous, but he offered to let me see his notes any time I asked. He never wrote things like, "What a freak," or "This kid is insane." Just simple notes to help him remember what we talked about. I'm sure he had "What a Freak" book somewhere, but he kept it hidden. And if he didn't have one yet, he was going to make one after this. I think, I said, watching his face for a reaction, that fate wants me to become a serial killer. He raised an eyebrow, nothing more. I told you he was calm. Well, he said, you're obviously fascinated by them. You've read more on the subject than probably anyone in town, including me. Do you want to become a serial killer? Of course not, he said. I specifically want to avoid becoming a serial killer. I just don't know how much of a chance I have. So, the things you want to avoid doing are what? Killing people? He peered at me crookedly, a sign that had come to know meant he was joking. He always said something a little sarcastic when we started getting into the really heavy stuff. I think it was his way of coping with anxiety. When I told him about the time I dissected a live gopher layer by layer, he cracked 3 jokes in a row and almost giggled. If you've broken a rule that big, he continued, I am obligated to go to police, confidentiality or no. I learned the laws about patient confidentiality in one of our very first sessions, when I first talked about starting fires. If he thought that I had committed a crime, or that I was intending to, or if he thought that I was a legitimate danger to anyone, the law required him to tell the right authorities. He was also free under the law to discuss anything I said with my mother, whether he had a good reason or not. The two of them had plenty of discussions over the summer. She made my life hell because of them. The things I want to avoid are much lower on the ladder than killing, said. Serial killers are usually, virtually always, in fact, slaves to their own compulsions. They kill because they have to, and they can't stop themselves. I don't want to get to that point, so I set up rules about smaller things, like how I like to watch people. I don't let myself watch one person for too long. If I do, I force myself to ignore that person for a whole week and not even think about it. So you have rules to stop yourself from small serial killer behaviors, said Neblin, in order to stay as far away from the big stuff as you can. Exactly. I think it's interesting, said, that you use the word compulsions. That kind of removes the issue of responsibility. But I'm taking responsibility, I said. I'm trying to stop it. You are, he said, and that's very admirable. But you started this whole conversation by saying that fate wants you to be a serial killer. If you tell yourself that it's your destiny to become a serial killer, then you aren't really just dodging responsibility by passing the blame to fate. I say fate, I explained, because this goes way beyond some simple behavioral quirks. There are some aspects of my life that I can't control, and they can only be explained by fate. Such as? I'm named after a serial killer? I said John Wayne Gacy killed 33 people in Chicago and buried most of them in the crawl space under his house. Your parents didn't name you after John Wayne Gacy, said Neblin. Believe it or not, I specifically asked your mum about it. You did? I'm smarter than I look, said. But you need to remember that one coincidental link to a serial killer is not destiny. My dad's name is Sam, I said. That makes me the son of Sam. Serial killer in New York who said his dog told him to kill. So you have a coincidental link to two serial killers, he said. That's a little odd, I'll admit, but still not seeing a cosmic conspiracy against you. My last name is Cleaver, I said. How many people do you know who are named after two serial killers and a murder weapon? Dr. Neblin shifted in his chair, tapping his pen against his paper. This I knew meant that he was trying to think. John, he said after a moment, I'd like to know what kinds of things scare you. Specifically, so let's pull back and look at what you said earlier. What are some of your rules? I told you about watching people. That's a big one. I love watching people. But I know that if I watch one person for too long, I'll start to get too interested in them. And I'll want to follow them. Watch where they go. See who they talk to. Find out what makes them tick. A few years ago, I realized that I was actually stalking a girl at school. Literally following her around everywhere. That kind of thing can get too far in a hurry. So I made a rule. If I watch one person for too long, I then ignore them for a whole week. Neblin nodded but didn't interrupt. I was glad he didn't ask me the girl's name, because even talking about her like this felt like breaking my rule again. Then I have a rule about animals, I said. You remember what I did to the gopher? Neblin smiled nervously. The gopher certainly doesn't. His nervous jokes were getting lamer. That wasn't the only time, I said. My dad used to set out traps in our garden for gophers and moles and stuff, and my job every morning was to go out and check them and bash anything that wasn't dead with a shovel. When I was 7, I started to cut them open to see what they looked like on the inside. But after I started studying serial killers, I stopped doing that. Have you heard of the McDonald Triad? 3 traits shared by 95% of serial killers, said Dr. Neblin. Bedwetting, pyromania, and animal cruelty. You do, I admit, have all 3. I discovered that when I was 8, I said. What really got to me was not the fact that the cruelty could predict violent behavior. It's that up until I read about it, I never thought that it was wrong. I was killing animals and taking them apart. I had all the emotional reaction of a kid playing with Legos. It's like they weren't real to me. They were just toys to play with, things. If you didn't feel that it was wrong, asked Dr. Neblin, why did you stop? Because that's when I first realized that I was different from other people, I said. There was something that I did all the time and thought nothing of it, and it turns out the rest of the world thinks it's completely reprehensible. That's when I knew I needed to change, so I started making rules. The first one was, don't mess with animals. Don't kill them. Don't do anything to them. I said, I won't have a pet. I won't pet a dog on the street. I don't even like to go into a house where someone has an animal. I avoid any situation that might lead me back to do something I know I shouldn't. Neblin looked at me for a moment. Any others? He asked. If I ever feel like hurting someone, I said, I give them a compliment. If someone's really bugging me until I hate them so much I start to imagine myself killing them, I say something nice and smile really big. It forces me to think nice thoughts instead of bad ones, and it usually makes them go away. Neblin thought for a moment before speaking. That's why you read so much about serial killers, he said. You don't feel right or wrong the way the other people do, so you read about it to find out what you're supposed to avoid. I nodded. And of course it helps that they're pretty cool to read about. He made some notes on his pad. So, which rule did you break today? He asked. I went to the place where they found Jeb Jolly's body, I said. I wondered why you hadn't mentioned him yet, he said. Do you have a rule to stay away from violent crime scenes? Not specifically, I said. That's why I was able to justify it to myself. I wasn't really breaking a specific rule, even if I was breaking the spirit of them. And why did you go? Because someone was killed there, I said. I had to see it. Were you a slave to your compulsion? He asked. You're not supposed to turn that around on me. I kind of am, said Neblin. I'm a therapist. I see dead bodies all the time in the mortuary, I said, and I think that's fine. Mom and Margaret have worked there for years, and they're not serial killers, so I see lots of live people and I see lots of dead people, but I've never really actually seen a live person turn into a dead one. I'm curious. And the scene of a crime is the closest you can get without committing the crime yourself. Yes, he said. Listen, John, said Neblin, leaning forward. You have a lot of predictors for serial killer behavior. I know, in fact, that you have more predictors than I've ever seen in one person. But you have to remember that predictors are just that. They predict what might happen. They don't prophesy what will. 95% of serial killers wet their beds and light fires and hurt animals. But that doesn't mean that 95% of kids who do those things will be serial killers. You're always in control of your own destiny. And you're always the one who makes your own choices, no one else. The fact that you have those rules, that you follow them so carefully, says a lot about you and your character. You're a good person, John. I'm a good person, I said, because I know what good people are supposed to act like, and I copy them. If you're as thorough as you say you are, said Neblin, nobody will ever know the difference. But if I'm not thorough enough, I said, looking out the window, who knows what could happen?